Welcome to this week's edition of You Opt to Know, the Daily Orange's opinion section podcast. I'm assistant editorial editor Michael Sessa, and this week I'm joined by our moderate columnist Lauren Spiezia.
Thanks for having me.
So tonight we're going to talk about the Voter Empowerment Act, which is a bill that Senator Gillibrand is working to reintroduce to the floor. So what would the act do if it became law, and why do you think she's trying to push for it to be approved right now?
So I think she decided to reintroduce it, especially with the 2020 presidential election coming up, and especially because the Mueller investigation was just recently released, and there's just been a lot of talk about transparency and accountability in the voting system. So that was something that I kind of discussed in my article, is kind of how voter turnout and like voter reliability can increase if the Voter Empowerment Act was passed. So
you wrote in your column that with voting reform, the results of the 2020 election could be more representative of what the American people actually think. So do you think past elections haven't been representative?
I think yes and no, especially for some groups, because there are some groups I talk about specifically, especially with people that are overseas and maybe younger people and people with disabilities, that they have maybe not been accurately represented, or their voice hasn't been accurately represented because they face certain obstacles when voting. So like one example is if someone lives in a rural community, the polling places could be few and far in between, or they're not accessible for people with disabilities. So that's something that I think is really important. It's just making sure that everyone's voice is heard regardless of what demographic they're in.
Cool. So there was another stat in your column that only 57% of eligible voters actually cast a ballot in the 2016 presidential election. So what specific changes do you think could raise those numbers?
So I think definitely modernizing the voting registration system, because one of it was to make it online, which would make it so much easier for college students or maybe people who have difficulty, especially like talking about those rural communities that may not necessarily have access to a ballot, or people overseas. So I think that just making the process easier could also encourage more people to vote, because what a major issue is transparency in the voting system, and because there are there's examples of like voting caging and certain like voter suppression. I think it's really important to making sure that it's just as easy as possible to cast a ballot, because it could just make more voices heard and make people just trust the system more.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, or if you'd like to send us a letter to the editor, you can email us at opinion@dailyorange.com. We'll see you next week.